You have two choices, human.
The lithium mines, or my daughter.
Funny. Most people offer flowers before proposing marriage.
The iron grating of the floor tasted like rust and stale copper. I was waiting for the executioner's boots. Instead, the queen walked in, smelling of ozone and crushed mint, and offered me a deal. My life and freedom, in exchange for marrying her grieving daughter. Some choice. The holding cell sat at a crisp 4 degrees Celsius. It was a precise, calculated temperature, just cold enough to keep you shivering and awake, but just warm enough to keep the frostbite from claiming your fingers. I spent most of my time curled around the ventilation grate, stealing the faint drafts of recycled air that smelled like ammonia and old sweat. My left ribs were bruised, maybe fractured. Every breath I took came with a sharp, clicking protest in my chest. I licked my cracked lips, tasting blood. 6 weeks as a prisoner of the ruling families on Aegis Prime had systematically stripped away whatever human bravado I'd landed with. I wasn't a soldier anymore. I was a sack of aching bones, waiting for the firing squad. Heavy boots echoed down the corridor. Not the rhythmic dragging shuffle of the guards, but the sharp, purposeful click of hard heels against the stone. I didn't bother sitting up. I just tilted my head, pressing my cheek against the freezing iron. The heavy security door slid open with a pneumatic hiss that made my teeth ache. 2 guards stepped in, first hulking men in kinetic armor, their faces obscured by mirrored visors. Then came the queen, Eleanor. She didn't wear a crown. Queens in this sector didn't need to. She wore a high-collared coat of dark, spun carbon, rigid and immaculate. She smelled entirely out of place in this dungeon. Ozone, static electricity, and crushed mint. It was a sharp, aggressive scent that cut right through the stench of unwashed bodies and despair. She stopped at the edge of my cell, looking down at me. Her pale eyes were unblinking, mapping the bruises on my face, the dirt under my fingernails. "You look pathetic, Cole," she said. Her voice was quiet. It didn't bounce off the walls. It seemed to sink into them. "I aim to please," I rasped. The words tore at my dry throat, triggering a fit of coughing. I brought a hand up, wiping a fresh streak of saliva and blood from my chin. "Is it time? Tell the firing squad to aim for the head. I'm tired of my chest hurting." Eleanor didn't smile. She just clasped her hands behind her back. "There is no firing squad today. The political climate has shifted. Public executions of human smugglers are currently distasteful to the inner council. They want quiet resolutions." "So, poison in my rations?" I asked, pushing myself up into a sitting position. The room spun for a second. I leaned against the damp wall, letting the cold stone support my weight. "Nothing so crude," Eleanor replied. She took a step closer to the bars. "I have a proposition. You are going to sign a binding union contract. You are going to marry my daughter." I stared at her. The hum of the ventilation fan seemed to grow louder. I waited for the punchline, for the cruel twist, but her face remained a mask of polite indifference. "Josephine," I said, the name feeling heavy on my tongue. "The one who just got widowed? Her husband died last week. Ship malfunction, wasn't it?" "A tragic accident," Eleanor said, smoothly, though the slight tightening of her jaw told me it was anything but. "Josephine is grieving. She is vulnerable. And, more importantly, as a widow, without an heir, her estate and her seat on the council revert to the state in 30 days unless she remarries." I let out a short, barking laugh that turned into a wheeze. "So you want to marry her off to a human convict? A smuggler? The council will eat her alive. The council cannot contest a legally binding union, regardless of the spouse's origin," Eleanor corrected. "And a human has no political standing, no family backing, no inherited loyalties. You are a blank slate. You cannot threaten my power, nor can you rally the other families against me. You will simply be a placeholder, a warm body to keep her estate secured. And if I say no?" Eleanor finally smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. "Then we stick to the original plan. You will not face a firing squad. You will simply be transferred to the lower-level lithium mines. The life expectancy there is roughly 4 months. Your lungs will crystalline before the first snow falls. I looked at my hands. They were trembling, ingrained with dirt and dried blood. I thought about the mines. I thought about the suffocating darkness, the slow, agonizing death. Then I thought about a bed. Hot water. Real food. It wasn't a choice. It was an ultimatum, wrapped in a white ribbon. "What's the catch?" I asked, looking back up at her. "There's always a catch. Why not one of your own obedient nobles?" "Because a noble has ambitions," Eleanor said, turning away. "You only have a desire to survive. That makes you predictable. Behave. Play the part of the devoted husband, and you will live a very comfortable life. Fail me, and I will personally see you thrown out an airlock." She signaled to the guards. "Clean him up. He smells like a corpse. The ceremony is tomorrow." The transition from a freezing cell to the upper levels of the palace was a physical shock to my system. The guards dragged me to a sterilization block, shoving me under a high-pressure decontamination shower. The water was scalding. It hit my skin like needles, instantly turning my pale, dirt-caked flesh a painful, bright red. I bit my tongue to keep from yelling as the automated scrubbers went to work, harsh bristles tearing at my bruises and the shallow cuts on my back. The air was thick with the suffocating fumes of industrial-grade chemical soap, something that smelled like bleach and synthetic lavender. By the time they hauled me out and threw a towel at me, I felt raw, stripped of a layer of skin, and dizzy from the heat. A tailor was waiting. A quiet, terrifyingly efficient man who said absolutely nothing as he forced me into formal wear. The clothes were rigid. The collar of the slate-gray tunic dug sharply into my throat, lined with a stiff, synthetic velvet that scratched my skin every time I swallowed. The boots were too tight across the bridge of my foot, forcing me to walk with a stiff, measured gait. "She is waiting in the conservatory," one of the guards muttered, shoving me down a wide, sunlit hallway. The floor was polished marble, blindingly white under the overhead lumens. The silence in the upper palace was heavy, oppressive. No screaming, no clanking metal. Just the soft, relentless hum of the climate control systems. The conservatory was a massive glass dome clinging to the side of the palace, overlooking the frozen tundra of the capital city. The air inside was stiflingly warm and humid, heavy with the cloying, rotting sweet scent of blooming orchids and damp soil. Condensation dripped down the thick glass panes. Josephine was sitting on a wrought iron bench near a cluster of pale, carnivorous-looking ferns. She didn't look like a grieving widow. She didn't look like a blushing bride, either. She looked like someone holding a live grenade. She wore deep mourning colors, a high-necked gown of midnight blue that swallowed the light. A veil of dark, translucent mesh covered the top half of her face, but it couldn't hide the sharp, aggressive set of her jaw. As I approached, my tight boots squeaking faintly on the damp tiles, she didn't stand. "So," she said. Her voice was raspy, exhausted, carrying the faint tremor of someone who had been screaming into a pillow. "You're the stray dog my mother brought in off the street." I stopped a few feet away, hooking my thumbs into the uncomfortable belt around my waist. "Nice to meet you, too. I'm Cole." Josephine tilted her head, inspecting me through the dark mesh. I could smell stale incense lingering on her clothes, fighting a losing battle against the overwhelming scent of the orchids. "You're limping," she noted. "Your guards have heavy boots," I replied. "And my ribs are currently negotiating a peace treaty with my lungs. Give it time." She let out a short, breathy scoff. She stood up, smoothing the front of her heavy dress. She was tall, almost eye level with me, and despite the elegant clothing, there was a rigid tension in her shoulders. As she crossed her arms, the sleeve of her gown shifted, and I caught a glimpse of her right hand. The knuckles were split, bruised a deep, ugly purple. She caught me looking, and quickly pulled the sleeve down, hiding her hand. "Arthur has been dead for 8 days, she said, her voice dropping to a flat, dangerous register. "And my mother has already bought his replacement. Tell me, human, how much did my estate cost?" "A pardon from the lithium mines and a hot shower," I answered honestly. I wasn't going to play court politics. I didn't know the rules, and I was too tired to learn them. "I don't want your estate. I don't want your mother's politics. I just want to breathe air that doesn't smell like piss. Josephine stepped closer. I forced myself not to flinch as she invaded my space. I could see her eyes now through the veil. They were bloodshot, rimmed with dark circles of exhaustion. "You think this is a rescue?" she whispered, the scent of bitter coffee on her breath. "You think you're safe now because you're wearing a silk collar instead of an iron one?" "I think," I said slowly, meeting her bloodshot eyes, "that we're both standing in a cage. Yours is just decorated better." For a long, agonizing second, the silence stretched between us. A heavy drop of condensation fell from the glass ceiling, splashing loudly onto the broad leaf of a fern. The anger in her posture didn't vanish, but it shifted. The hostility fractured, revealing a bone-deep exhaustion underneath. She looked away, her jaw clenching as she stared out through the foggy glass at the icy wasteland below. "The ceremony is at sundown," she said, her voice hollow. "Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't look at the council members. And for God's sake, try not to bleed on the contract." She turned and walked past me, her heavy skirts rustling against the wet stone floor. I stood alone in the suffocating heat of the greenhouse, sweating in my stiff collar, realizing with a sinking gut that this woman wasn't a pawn. She was a powder keg. The wedding was an exercise in sensory assault. The great hall was a cavernous space of dark wood and polished brass, lit by hundreds of floating camera drones that buzzed like a swarm of angry hornets. Every time a drone flashed its blinding white light, my headache flared, a sharp pulsing pain behind my left eye. The crowd of nobles watched us with polite, predatory silence. They didn't cheer. They didn't smile. They stared. I could feel their eyes picking me apart, judging my posture, the slight drag of my right foot, the obvious discomfort I felt in my own skin. I was a novelty, a mud-born human, elevated to the high court. I could practically smell their disdain, a collective scent of sour perfume and powdered chalk. Josephine stood beside me at the altar, rigid as a statue. Her hand, when I was forced to take it for the binding ritual, was freezing cold. Her skin was clammy, trembling so slightly that I only felt it because her bruised knuckles were pressed directly into my palm. An ancient cleric in heavy robes chanted something in the old tongue, a guttural, grinding language that sounded like two pieces of slate scraping together. Then came the chalice, a heavy, tarnished silver cup filled with ceremonial wine. Josephine drank first, swallowing with a grimace. When she passed it to me, our fingers brushed. I brought it to my lips. It tasted like ash, fermented berries, and copper. I forced it down, fighting the immediate urge to gag, and handed the cup back. The electronic contract was produced. I pressed my thumb to the glass surface, leaving a bloody, biometric smear. The drones flashed wildly. It was done. I was property of the estate. The reception was a blur of hostile whispers and forced proximity. Josephine didn't speak to me. She stood by my side, gripping a glass of clear liquor like a weapon, staring through anyone who tried to offer condolences or congratulations. I stood there, sweating in my tight collar, chewing the inside of my cheek until it bled, just to stay awake. By midnight, the doors to her private chambers finally closed behind us, the heavy biometric locks engaging with a solid, definitive times clank. The silence that followed was deafening. Her quarters were massive, decorated in muted grays and deep blues, smelling faintly of the same bitter incense she wore. A massive bed dominated the center of the room, draped in heavy furs. I didn't move toward it. I stood awkwardly by the door, suddenly hyper-aware of my own breathing. I reached up, hooking a finger under the stiff, scratching velvet of my collar, and pulled, popping the first two metal clasps. I let out a long, shuddering breath. Josephine walked over to a heavy wooden vanity. She didn't look at me in the mirror. She reached up and unpinned the dark mourning veil, letting it fall to the floor in a crumpled heap. She stared at her own reflection for a long moment, her chest rising and falling heavily. "You can take the couch," she said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. "I've slept on concrete for a month and a half," I muttered, unfastening the rigid cuffs of my tunic. "The floor is fine." I walked over to the corner of the room, far from the bed, and sat down on the thick, woven rug. I pulled my boots off, groaning as the pressure released from my swollen feet. I peeled the stiff tunic off, leaving me in just the thin undershirt, and leaned my head back against the wall, closing my eyes. "Why didn't you fight back?" Her voice was sudden, cutting through the quiet. I opened one eye. Josephine had turned around, leaning her hips against the vanity. She was looking at my chest, at the dark, ugly tapestry of black and yellow bruises wrapping around my ribs, the fading scars from my capture. "Against the guards?" I asked tiredly. "I'm a human, Josephine, not a superhero. There were 5 of them. They had kinetic rifles. I had a rusty wrench." "Not the guards," she said, crossing her arms. "My mother. When she offered you the deal, humans are supposed to be proud, defiant. You just rolled over and signed the paper." I let out a harsh breath, rubbing the bridge of my nose. Pride is a luxury for people who know where their next meal is coming from. I was freezing to death. I wanted to live. "It's not poetry, it's just biology." She stared at me, her red-rimmed eyes narrowing. She walked over to a small side table, picking up a heavy crystal decanter. She poured 2 glasses of amber liquid, walked over, and held one out to me. I looked at it, then up at her. I took it, sniffing it cautiously. It smelled like peat and smoke. Real whiskey. "Arthur's favorite," she said, taking a sip from her own glass. She stood over me, looking down. "Do you know how Arthur died, Cole?" "Your mother said a ship malfunction." Josephine let out a harsh, bitter sound that was almost a laugh. "Arthur was a cautious man. He triple-checked his thrusters before leaving the atmosphere. His ship didn't malfunction. The atmospheric scrubbers were flooded with carbon monoxide. He choked to death in the dark." I stopped with the glass halfway to my mouth. I looked up at her face. The grief wasn't just sadness. It was a frantic, paranoid terror. "Who?" I asked softly. "Does it matter?" she snapped, pacing away from me, her heavy skirts swishing against the rug. "My mother, the inner council, the rival estates. They all wanted his seat. He was a moderate, and they want war." She stopped by the window, gripping the heavy velvet drapes. "My mother thinks she outsmarted everyone. She thinks she bought me a docile pet, a broken, traumatized prisoner who will sit quietly in the corner, attend the galas, and keep my estate out of the hands of her rivals while she consolidates power." She turned back to me, her eyes burning with a sudden, frantic intensity. The bruised knuckles on her right hand were white from gripping the glass. "But I read your file, Cole," she whispered. "I know what you did on the border colonies. I know why the smugglers hired you. You aren't a diplomat. You aren't a gentleman." I slowly lowered the glass of whiskey, my muscles tightening instinctively. The exhaustion was still there, but a cold spike of adrenaline began to push it aside. "What do you want from me, Josephine?" I asked, my voice dropping. She walked back over, kneeling on the rug in front of me so we were eye to eye. I could smell the sweat on her skin, the fear she was trying so desperately to hide. "They murdered my husband," she breathed, her voice shaking with raw, unfiltered hate. "They are going to try to murder me. My mother expects a leashed dog." She reached out, her trembling, bruised hand wrapping around my wrist. "I need a wolf. I need you to show them exactly why this sector is terrified of humans." I looked at her desperate, tear-stained face, then down at her hand, gripping mine. I took a slow sip of the whiskey. It burned perfectly, all the way down. "All right," I said quietly. "Let's bite someone." The following 2 weeks were a masterclass in psychological warfare, waged entirely over crystal wine glasses and platinum plates. I didn't heal. I just learned to hide the limp better. Josephine's private physician, a terrifyingly quiet man named Gregory, pumped me full of synthetic adrenaline and bone-knit stims that tasted like battery acid and made my teeth grind in my sleep. By day, I wore the slate-gray tunics of the estate. By night, I lay awake on the thick rug, listening to Josephine pace the length of the bedroom, the heavy velvet of her gown dragging across the floor like a dying breath. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. We were both feral animals, locked in a gilded cage, waiting for the handler to open the door. That door opened on the night of the winter solstice banquet. The great hall was transformed. Massive sculptures of blue ice dominated the corners of the room, slowly weeping freezing water into silver catch basins. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meats that made my stomach churn, heavily layered under the cloying, powdery perfumes of the nobility. "Keep your chin down," Josephine murmured, her arm looped rigidly through mine. They view direct eye contact from a lower caste as a challenge. "I am a challenge," I muttered back, fighting the urge to scratch at the stiff collar digging into my neck. "And I'm not lower caste anymore. I'm your devoted husband. Remember?" Josephine's fingers tightened on my forearm, her sharp nails digging through the fabric of my sleeve. "Don't be arrogant, Cole. Arrogance gets you killed here. Watch Lord Hastings, by the pillar, the one wearing the crimson sash." I shifted my gaze. Hastings was a towering man, broad-shouldered and heavy-set, with pale, doughy skin and eyes like wet stones. He was holding court among a group of younger nobles, laughing at something I couldn't hear. He didn't look like an assassin. He looked like a bored accountant. "He controls the shipping lanes in the outer atmospheric ring," Josephine whispered, her breath brushing my ear. It was a gesture meant to look affectionate to the onlookers, but her voice was pure ice. "He was the one who inspected Arthur's ship the morning it launched. He signed the clearance forms. You think he flooded the scrubbers? I know he did. He's been trying to force a merger between our estates for 3 years. Before I could reply, Hastings caught our gaze. His wet, gray eyes locked onto Josephine, and a slow, oily smile spread across his face. He detached himself from his group and began making his way toward us, weaving through the crowd with the heavy, unbothered momentum of a predator who knew he owned the territory. My muscles tightened instinctively. My right ribs gave a sharp, familiar throb. "Josephine," Hastings boomed as he approached. His voice was resonant, overly loud, designed to draw the attention of the surrounding nobles. The whispering in our immediate vicinity died down. Eyes turned toward us. "You look radiant. The mourning period suits you, though I must admit, I am surprised to see you in the company of an import." He didn't look at me. I was a piece of furniture, a handbag. "Lord Hastings," Josephine said. Her voice was perfectly level, but I could feel the microscopic tremor in her arm. "Cole is my husband. The estate is secure. You can call off your lawyers." Hastings chuckled, a wet rattling sound in his chest. He took a sip from his glass, closing the distance between us until I could smell the fermented yeast on his breath, mixed with the sour tang of anxiety sweat he was trying to cover up with heavy cologne. "A temporary measure, surely," Hastings said, leaning in slightly, his voice dropping to a register meant only for the 3 of us. "A human. How entirely tragic. They are so fragile, aren't they? Short lifespans, prone to sudden violent ends. It would be a terrible shame if you were to suffer a second bereavement, Josephine. The dark of space is so very cold." It was a clumsy threat, heavy-handed and dripping with entitlement. He was banking on the fact that an alien noble would never break decorum in the middle of a solstice banquet. He was banking on the fact that I was a broken, terrified prisoner who didn't understand the rules of engagement. He was right. I didn't care about the rules. I didn't say a word. I simply let go of Josephine's arm, stepped forward, and placed my hand casually on Hastings' chest, right over his crimson sash. Hastings stopped talking. He blinked, looking down at my hand in absolute bewilderment, as if a dog had suddenly climbed onto the dinner table. "Remove your hand, you filthy." I didn't punch him. That would cause a scene. Instead, I shifted my grip, my fingers finding the thick cluster of nerves buried under the meat of his collarbone. Humans evolved on a high-gravity death world. Our muscle density was a biological anomaly in this sector. I squeezed. I put every ounce of my frustration, every cold night in the holding cell, and every ache in my bruised ribs into my grip. Hastings' breath hitched. His eyes bulged, the wet gray irises suddenly swimming in panic. His mouth opened to scream. But the pain was so sudden, so structurally overwhelming, that his diaphragm locked. I stepped half an inch closer, invading his personal space, smiling a flat, dead-eyed smile. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely carrying over the ambient noise of the hall. "I don't think we've been properly introduced. I'm Cole." He tried to pull away, but my fingers were locked like a vice around his clavicle. I could feel the bone grinding under the pressure. A pathetic, high-pitched wheeze squeaked out of his throat. His glass of wine slipped from his trembling fingers, shattering on the marble floor. The sound of breaking glass drew a few startled looks. But from the outside, it just looked like two men, standing too close, sharing a quiet conversation. "My wife tells me you know a lot about ship maintenance," I continued, keeping my voice gentle, almost conversational. "I'm a paranoid man, Lord Hastings. I don't like accidents. If the gravity plating on my bed fails, if my morning coffee tastes slightly metallic, or if my wife so much as trips on a loose rug, I am going to come to your estate. I am going to bypass your guards, and I am going to physically tear your throat out with my teeth. Do you understand the translation? Or should I speak slower?" Hastings' face was turning a mottled, ugly purple. A bead of sweat rolled down his doughy cheek. He managed a frantic, jerky nod. I held the grip for 3 more agonizing seconds, ensuring the memory of the pain was permanently burned into his nervous system before casually releasing him. I smoothed the lapel of his tunic, stepped back, and offered him a polite, shallow bow. "Enjoy the banquet," I said. Hastings staggered backward, clutching his chest, gasping for air like a landed fish. He looked at me not with disdain, but with pure, unadulterated terror. He didn't say another word. He turned and shoved his way blindly through the crowd, practically running toward the exit. Silence rippled outward from our position. The surrounding nobles had seen enough of the exchange to realize something fundamentally wrong had just occurred. The import had just humiliated a high lord without raising a fist. I turned back to Josephine and offered my arm. She stared at me through the dark mesh of her veil. Her chest was rising and falling rapidly. Slowly, deliberately, she slipped her hand back into the crook of my arm. "You're insane," she whispered, her voice trembling not with fear, but with something dangerously close to exhilaration. "I'm hungry," I replied, ignoring the stares boring into my back. "Let's find something that isn't roasted." The adrenaline crash hit me the moment we stepped into the private elevator leading to the residential wing. My hands started to shake, a fine, uncontrollable tremor in my fingers. I leaned against the polished brass wall of the carriage, closing my eyes as the pneumatic lift carried us upward. "He's going to kill us," Josephine said. She was standing in the center of the elevator, staring at the floor indicator. Her voice was flat, stating a fact rather than expressing panic. "Hastings can't let that public humiliation stand. He'll send the guild." "Let him," I said tiredly, rubbing my temple. "If he hires assassins, it means he's scared to do it himself. Cowards make mistakes." The elevator hummed, a low, vibrating sound that traveled up through my boots. Then it stopped. We were between floors. The lights flickered, a sharp, buzzing electrical fault, before dying completely. Emergency lumens kicked in a second later, blood-red strips of light running along the floorboards, casting long, grotesque shadows across the carriage. The silence was absolute. The background hum of the palace's climate control was gone. "Cole," Josephine whispered. "I know." I pushed off the wall. The fatigue vanished, vaporized by the sudden, icy spike of survival instinct. I didn't have a weapon. I was wearing a stiff, formal tunic and tight boots. I looked up at the ceiling hatch of the elevator. Clank. Heavy, magnetic boots on the roof of the carriage. "Get behind me," I snapped, grabbing Josephine by the shoulder and shoving her into the corner of the elevator, near the control panel. The ceiling hatch didn't open. It blew inward. A localized breaching charge ripped the metal paneling apart in a shower of sparks and blinding white light. The concussive force hit me like a physical wall, throwing me backward. I slammed into the brass wall, my fractured ribs screaming in protest. The air instantly smelled of ozone, burned wiring, and vaporized metal. Before the smoke could even clear, the first assassin dropped through the hole. He was wearing light tactical armor, pitch black and silent. In his right hand, a kinetic blade hummed a short, brutal weapon that vibrated at a frequency high enough to separate molecular bonds. It glowed with a faint, angry blue light. He lunged. It wasn't a duel. It was a butchery. I didn't try to block the blade. That would mean losing an arm. I threw myself sideways, dropping to one knee. The kinetic blade hissed past my ear, singing the hair on the side of my head and gouging a deep, glowing trench into the brass paneling behind me. I drove my shoulder directly into his kneecap. The joint popped with a sickening, wet crunch. The assassin grunted, his momentum carrying him forward. As he stumbled, I grabbed the heavy, thick fabric of his tactical vest, planted my boot on his unbroken leg, and pulled backward with everything I had. He crashed onto the floor of the elevator. I didn't hesitate. I dropped my knee directly onto his throat, grabbing his wrist with both hands and twisting it until the bones snapped. The kinetic blade clattered to the floor, melting a burn mark into the rug. A second shadow dropped through the ceiling hatch. This one didn't hesitate. He landed on the dead weight of his comrade and swung a heavy, weighted baton directly at my head. I raised my left arm to guard. The impact shattered my forearm. The pain was a white-hot flash behind my eyes. A choked scream tore out of my throat as my arm went entirely numb, dropping limply to my side. The assassin reared back for a second strike, aiming for my skull. A deafening roar filled the confined space of the elevator. The sound was so loud it physically rattled my teeth. The assassin above me jerked violently, his chest armor suddenly exploding outward in a spray of blood and shattered ceramic plating. He collapsed sideways, dead before he hit the floor. I lay there on my back, gasping for air, clutching my broken arm. The smell of cordite and copper blood was suffocating. My ears were ringing, a high, continuous pitch that drowned out everything else. I rolled my head to the side. Josephine was standing in the corner, her heavy mourning gown covered in dust and ash. In her hands, gripped tight enough to turn her knuckles white, was a heavy, archaic slug thrower, a human weapon. The barrel was smoking. She stood frozen, staring at the body of the second assassin, the gun shaking wildly in her grip. "Josephine," I rasped, trying to sit up. The room spun. Blood from a cut on my forehead was dripping into my eye, stinging sharply. "Josephine, drop it." She blinked, the trance breaking. She looked at me, then at the smoking gun. She let it fall to the floor with a heavy thud. She rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside me, her hands hovering uselessly over my broken arm. "You're bleeding," she said, her voice entirely stripped of its aristocratic polish. She sounded terrified. She sounded human. "Yeah, well, it's my party trick," I coughed, tasting blood. I leaned my head back against the wall, looking at the two dead bodies cluttering the floor of the elevator. "Where did you get the gun?" "Arthur," she whispered, tearing a strip of fabric from the hem of her gown to press against the gash on my forehead. Her hands were shaking, but her touch was surprisingly gentle. "He bought it on the black market. He said kinetic shielding couldn't stop a physical piece of lead. He hid it in the elevator paneling." "Smart man," I breathed, closing my eyes. The emergency lights flickered, and suddenly the elevator jerked into motion again, continuing its ascent. The internal communication speaker crackled to life. "Josephine." It was Eleanor's voice. The Queen. It was calm, measured, and entirely devoid of panic. Security sensors indicate a breach in carriage 4. "Are you alive?" Josephine stopped pressing the cloth to my head. She looked at the speaker grill, then down at me, and finally at the two dead assassins belonging to Lord Hastings. The fear in her eyes was slowly evaporating, replaced by the same cold, raw fury I had seen in her on the day we met. She reached up and keyed the comms button. "I am alive, Mother," Josephine said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "Hastings sent his dogs. My husband killed one. I shot the other." A long pause hung over the radio. When Eleanor spoke again, the polite indifference was gone. There was a sharp edge of realization in her tone. Understood. Security forces will meet you at the residential doors. I will summon the physician for Cole. Don't bother, Josephine snapped back. Gregory works for you. I don't trust him anymore. Send a trauma team, and then summon the inner council. Tonight, Josephine, that is highly irregular. Arthur is dead. Hastings sent assassins into our home. The time for irregular is over. Josephine leaned closer to the microphone, her eyes locked on mine. Tell the council that my estate is formally declaring a blood feud against the House of Hastings. If they interfere, they bleed next. She released the button, cutting off her mother's response. The elevator chimed, a cheerful, automated sound as it arrived at our floor. The doors slid open to reveal a squad of heavily armed royal guards, their kinetic rifles raised, expecting a firefight. Instead, they found 2 dead assassins, a bleeding human smuggler, and a widow who was entirely done playing the victim. Josephine stood up, wiping a smear of blood from her cheek. She didn't look back at the guards. She reached down, offering me her unbroken hand. "Come on, Wolf," she whispered. "We have a war to fight." I looked at her hand, smiled through a mouthful of blood, and let her pull me to my feet. Thanks for diving into this dark, sci-fi HFY journey. If you felt the cold of the cell, the tension of the royal court, and the brutal reality of survival, hit that like button. Share it with your fellow sci-fi lovers, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more original stories where humanity flips the script on the alien aristocracy. Let me know in the comments, how do you think Cole and Josephine will handle the rest of the council? See you next time.